Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Spring 2021 Game Design Workshop. I am one of your hosts, Chloe, and without further ado, let's get into it. Here's a quick rundown of what we'll be talking about today. Our workshop goes into three main topics: building an experience, organizing mechanics, and paper prototyping. So to begin, let's talk about building an experience. Creating an experience. Here is yet another overview of a subsection of what we'll be discussing today. In this experience chapter, we will be discussing what exactly is an experience, how do we create an experience, and then the MDA framework, which falls into the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics of your game, as well as a summary of what we talked about in this section. So, what is an experience, or the experience we're trying to create? The experience is how you make your player feel in your game. Your game itself does not equal the experience. Your game is the medium or the place where your players interact to have that experience that you want for them overall. Think of it as your core game idea. It's how you want your players to feel after they've put down the controller. It's how you want your players to view and think about your game. And everything in your game should work towards your experience. And how do we go about creating that experience? Well, lucky for us, there's a very nifty framework we can use for developing games. It is a guideline as to how to produce the experience we want, and that is called the MDA framework, which is an acronym for Mechanics, Dynamics, and Aesthetics. And here we'll be taking you through each facet of the MDA framework. So let's start off with the M in MDA framework, the mechanics. What are mechanics? Well, mechanics are the rules that govern our game. It's how the player interacts with the world that we've given them. Think of Mario's jump. As a platformer, that's crucial to the game's development and overall feel. McCree's flashbang. As a competitive shooter, it's very important to have the ability to stop and hinder enemy players. And even something simple like Minecraft's sleep system. What happens when the player dies in that world and how can they go about getting their stuff? These are all types of mechanics that come from different genres of games, and we'll talk about mechanics more in later sections. And now for the D in the MDA framework, dynamics. Dynamics are the delivery system of our experience. It's more on the technical side. It is the how in game development. An example of this would be, how are we going to deliver a movement system in a platformer? Well, the easy answer is to create a movement system. And it sounds simple on paper, but you need to understand how to go about implementing your mechanics the right way. Otherwise, you get things that happen like Cyberpunk 76, and that's no bueno. And now for the final section of the MDA framework, aesthetics. Aesthetics are the reason to go about playing your game, and it's the most closely related to the overall experience you want to have for your player. Think of aesthetics almost as if the type of genre you expect your game to be in. An example of aesthetic choices would be the different types of aesthetics or the different reasons you would have to play for your game. For example, on the slide, aesthetic choices could be something like competition, games that are played for status and bragging rights, fellowship aesthetic choices, games made to bring people together, or even discovery aesthetic choices, games that let you explore and truly interact with the environment. These are the reasons to play your game. So with all that being said, here's some things to remember. Think about the experience that you want for your player. How do you want them to remember your game? Secondly, we need to think about our mechanics and how do they serve to the experience? How do the rules we've created in our environment help give that player those long-lasting memories we want them to have? And most importantly, think about your aesthetic. What type of game are you trying to develop? And does that game serve the experience you're trying to create? And with all that being said, ladies and gentlemen, it is now time to learn more about organizing mechanics and how we can go about implementing them.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of this game design workshop. My name is Dylan Ayala, and in this section we'll be organizing game mechanics. More specifically, we'll be analyzing what exactly mechanics are, what does scope mean, how to design around your scope, things to remember when creating your game this semester, and we'll be breaking down several game mechanics. So what exactly is a game mechanic? Well, game mechanics are rules or logic that govern what our game does. It's the rules that make the game fun and allows the players to interact and essentially have a purpose in the world. For example, how many times are we able to jump in the game? Can we have a double jump? Can we have a wall jump? It's a very simple mechanic, but it's a game mechanic nonetheless. One common misconception is that programmers are the ones to create the game mechanics and implement them. This isn't true, however, as all games incorporate a blend of all disciplines of game development, and having a proper scope is the key to completing this game mechanic and polishing it. But what exactly is scope? Well, scope is the scale or intensity of the game development process. It's how hard you think the project will be to complete. This encompasses all disciplines: sound design, programming, and artists. Um, and it's essentially your ability to do the assignment given to you. But what does this mean for game development? Well, again, it's the ability to do the assignment you were given. So, as an artist, are you able to animate this? Or as a programmer, are you able to program this mechanic? And as a sound designer, are you able to create this type of music? Being acquainted with your tools is really the first step in understanding your scope, but also experience and knowing your workflow really means being able to recognize your ability and if you're able to go for a more complicated method or mechanic. Be sure to consider this when making your project proposals, and be sure to ask yourself and your team how difficult this assignment will be for all of you. If you're not sure, be sure to contact an officer and discuss further with your team if this assignment might be too difficult for you to complete. So now let's go into each discipline on how to design around your scope. Well, as a programmer, it's a very good idea to break down the mechanics into its fundamental components. Like, do I need an array list, or what type of data structure will I be using? For example, how would Mario's jump work in Unity? Well, having experience before, I know that Mario is controlled by the player, so we'll need some way to get user input, and we'll also need him to be affected by gravity, and also have the ability to jump to a certain height and not jump infinitely. You don't have to necessarily know everything about the game mechanic, but it's nice to have a general idea to avoid surprises in the middle of coding. Something to remember is if you can get this done in a timely manner, remember that you have classes and bugs do happen no matter what. So, asking yourself if you would need help from an officer from your fellow programmers is a very good idea, and it's one of the main reasons why you should put so much thought into your scope. Also, think about what you know as a programmer. Have you coded in this language before? Do you know design patterns or certain data structures that might fit better when analyzing this mechanic? Moving on, how do we design within scope as an artist? Well, I think artists really do a lot more work than it seems like on surface level. They have to account for all the backgrounds, all the characters, all the enemies, and all the visual effects that will need to be made to make the game look presentable. One advice I can give to an artist is to be familiar with all your tools. This sometimes means having to learn the Unity interface. Sometimes you'll have to step in to put in your own art as programmers are swamped with all their work, and depending on the scope of the game, you might even have to learn a little bit of coding to help out the programmers. But I think this is a very useful asset even if you don't have to, because learning Unity as an artist can really make you more independent. Be sure to ask yourself and team some questions. If you feel overwhelmed, maybe you should ask yourself or your team to shorten the scope to account for all the work. Maybe shorten some levels or shorten the amount of characters there are in the game. And ask yourself, does every level and object really need different art assets? Or can we make more reusable assets within the levels? Finally, how do we design within scope as a sound designer? Well, I find sounds similar to art where there's also a lot more work than it seems like on the surface. Depending on the scope and theme of your game, you could have to create more sounds and themed music than you thought when you first came up with the idea. Um, Again, be familiar with your tools. If you need to, you might have to learn a little bit of code or the Unity interface to know how to implement these sounds yourself or music yourself. And of course, knowing the programs and the skills on how to create these sound effects helps tremendously. Um, Sounds quickly add up in a game, similar to art, and depending on the scope, everything might need a sound effect. So be sure to ask yourself and your team if every level needs its own sound effects or theme song, or if we should go with more reusable sounds. Moving on to more general advice, here are some things to remember. Be aware that these projects are only a semester long. We have only until launch party to complete these games, and that's April 30th. Be sure to stay organized and communicate with your team. Use the recommended programs that we provided during the first meeting to get things done. Stay connected with your officers. They're there to help, so reach out whenever you feel necessary. Use the VGDA Discord channels. Each discipline has their own channels to ask questions, and everyone's happy to help. So now that we know how to make game mechanics, let's try to break some down. So here's an old screenshot of an early Mario game. This shows plenty of game mechanics going on in one screenshot, so let's try to break this down slowly. So first of all, the top UI. We can see that each UI element has its own purpose. There's one for keeping score, there's one for knowing how many coins you have, there's one for seeing what level you're on, and there's one for how much time you have left in the current level. Looking at this from the screenshot, we can tell that it encompasses programming and art. Programming for keeping score and counting down with the timer, while for art, there's fonts and symbols. Secondly, in the green circle, we can see a coin coming out the block. We know that the player, having played Mario in the past, we know that the player has interacted with the block because a coin's coming out of it. Looking at this from the screenshot, we can see that it's actually a perfect blend of all disciplines. For programming, we have the collision with the block and adding that to the coin count. For art, we can see that the art of the blocks are different from the ones next to it after being collided with, the animation of the coin that plays after hitting it, and the movement of the block when you actually hit it. For sound, the sound effect that comes out the coin, the iconic sound effect, is an aspect of sound, and the sound of the collision of the block being hit itself. Thirdly, Mario jumping, hitting the block above him, and shooting fireballs. This is another great example of all disciplines coming together. For a programmer, that would mean controlling Mario, so getting user input, jump height and speed, the ability to shoot fireballs, and again, hitting the block. For an artist, Mario is currently doing animations, so we can see that he's jumping, running, and shooting fireballs all in a short sequence. For sounds, again, hitting the block would make the iconic coin sound, the iconic jumping sound that Mario makes every time he jumps, and the sound of fireballs being shot out. Finally, in the pink circle, we can see a Goomba being killed. This is another great example of all disciplines coming together to create a game mechanic. For programming, this would be recognizing when the Goomba should die and play its animation, the collision of the fireball hitting the Goomba, and also increasing the score at the top UI. For art, this would mean creating that death animation and the animations of the fireballs spinning and hitting the Goomba. For sound, this would mean creating the sound effect for the fireball actually hitting the Goomba and the score increasing, and maybe a sound effect for the Goomba dying. Now that we have broken down some game mechanics, let's try to create some of our own with a paper prototype.
So, first things first, we have a quick overview of what exactly we're going to be talking about in this section, such as what is paper prototyping, why do we do it, what's the goal of paper prototyping, how can we go about paper prototyping, what to do after paper prototyping, and collaborating and refining your paper prototype. So, let's jump into it. Paper prototyping. What is it? Well, paper prototyping is essentially your game idea explained on paper. It is a documentation and planning process that helps create the experience for your player. It is the pre production phase of your game. So, in a better way to think about this is the steps you go before you even go about working in Unity to develop your mechanics, working in Photoshop to start designing your characters, or working in FL Studio to start a soundtrack. This is what you do beforehand to make sure everything is planned and prepared so you can go to work. And this isn't just a game design exclusive ordeal. Paper prototyping is in near all facets of design and development. It's in gameplay programming, it is in web sign design, it is in architectural design, and so many other facets that I can't name off the top of my head. But essentially, pre production phase is possibly the most important phase of game development. So, why do we do prototyping? What's the point of it all? Well, it's cost effective both time wise and money wise. It's incredibly easy to do, and it allows you to test your ideas before you make them. Like I said, this is your pre production phase. This is what you do before you head into Unity or start using your tools that you plan to use to create this experience for your player. It's making sure you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's before you head into development mode. Because if you head into development mode without a plan, you're more often to get stuck and be confused during the whole work process. So, what's the goal in paper prototyping? Well, the goal in paper prototyping is to visualize the experience, and it's used as a way to convey your game idea to your teammates and other people who you plan to collaborate on this project. The whole point is to document the process or flow of your game, thinking through every aspect of your game you can think of. What's the ending to your game? How are players introduced to your ideas and mechanics? And what would it take for your mechanics to happen? All these ideas are encompassed in paper prototyping and they're incredibly valuable. Some of you may be asking, isn't this the same thing as mechanics organization? Almost, but not quite. Organizing mechanics is more along the lines of production and workflow, and it's specific towards each discipline. Paper prototyping is all about seeing the big picture, and organizing mechanics is more about the workflow to get to the big picture. So, again, just to reiterate, paper prototyping is all about the big picture, the entire experience that we set out for our player. And that encompasses more than just gameplay mechanics. Other aspects of game development are level design, the space in which your players use those mechanics. Are we currently using a space to our advantage to convey and help players use these mechanics? Pacing, the flow of your game and how that feels in relation to the player. Does the difficulty scale up with the player as they pick up more mechanics along the way? Is it stagnant? Does the player even like the flow to begin with, as in the order of mechanics you've set out for them to learn and master? And then there comes tonality. Do your mechanics work together with one another? These are things to consider during your paper prototyping, and that's why it's so crucial in development. It helps us solve these issues before they even become issues. So, with all that being said, now we know the what and why of paper prototyping. And now it's time to worry about the how. How can we convey our ideas on paper? Well, the first step is to start small. Keep a notebook of your ideas. And once you feel like you have enough ideas to warrant a whole game, draw them out. Draw pictures. It does not have to be pretty, it just has to be readable. Visualize your entire experience you're setting out for your player. Draw out what you think your game will look like. What does your UI look like for your player? What does your player look like in relation to your UI? And what do your gameplay mechanics look like as they are presented to your player? These are all things we need to think about when we are paper prototyping. Okay, now that we've been able to visually represent our game idea, now's the time to write down questions, comments, or concerns brought up by our design. It's guaranteed that it is no way, shape, or form perfect, as it is a paper prototype. Keyword being prototype. It does not represent the final product. So here's where we ask ourselves important questions. How far can the player jump? Does this level design fit the experience for the player we had out in mind? And we can also get even more specific with our questions, such as going into certain disciplines. How big should I draw these characters? What would it sound like to move in this environment? Things like that. Those are all questions you should be writing down, as well as any comments you have about how to fix those said questions or answer them, or any concerns such as, I don't know if we're able to implement this or this might be too big. Write all of that down because that is important, critical information you're going to need to convey to other people. So now we've finished paper prototyping. It looks beautiful. Good job. Now what? Share your ideas. Get feedback amongst your teammates. Game development is a collaborative effort. Use your paper prototype to represent your ideas to others. Here is where you can figure out what works and what doesn't, as well as get important feedback. This ensures everyone is on the same page, and if everyone isn't on the same page, discuss any issues or concerns that were brought up by your team. This is a collaborative effort. Everyone needs to be on board with this, and the only way to ensure that is to talk and communicate any discrepancies or concerns. If something feels out of whack, you could be out of scope, your mechanics might not fit as well as you want, or the experience isn't being kept. And all of those will have to be talked about and discussed among your group mates. Let it be known, everyone, that it's totally okay to go about changing up the original plan. That is the continuous process of game development, of collaborating, reiterating, and refining what we have. Some ideas may have to be scrapped, others can be worked upon and improved. But just know that is the ebb and flow of game design, and it's totally okay to start over again. Thank you to everyone who could attend our game design workshop. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to any of the instructors on our VGJ Discord channel. Have a good one!